Hello. For my defense of my research topic on the contributions of the American auto industry to the effort of the Second World War, I am addressing the research question of what exactly did the American auto industry contribute. We know that they mobilized their factories for the production of war necessities like tanks, airplanes, um, ammunitions, even. Uh, the Jeep was a result of the Second World War, actually, because the um, soldiers needed a light reconnaissance vehicle that was capable of traveling on all sorts of terrain. Um, the historic Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Um, the auto industry quit producing cars for civilian consumption in order to relocate the resources that would have been used in these cars or in the running of them, like gas, to produce airplanes. Um, They increased production by hiring women to supplement the workforce, which had been depleted by men going off to war. They they also aided in increasing production by um, issuing their own posters, which advocated for recycling of materials. Um, Now, the historical significance of the contributions of the American auto industry to the Second World War cannot be understated. Um, the people had known since the First World War that technological innovations were a great asset, as this is when the first airplanes were used to a great extent. They were used for all sorts of things, but it was known that during the Second World War, the Axis powers had already started generating a massive arsenal, and the auto industry, which consumed the most resources needed, would have to really step to the plate. The auto industry did step to the plate, despite the concerns expressed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt and high-ranking members of the military, such as General George Patton and George Marshall, which was not actually due to the resource consumption of the industry, such as it was about the effect that the Great Depression had had on the American economy. As A.J. Bamey states in his book, The Arsenal of Democracy, FDR, Detroit, and an Epic Quest to Arm an America at War, the result of the Great Depression was that there was very little weaponry, no legitimate manumissions industry, and the army itself was smaller than that of Belgium, a nation that could fit inside of Maryland. Now, to boost productivity, resources typically allocated for the production of domestic vehicles were relocated. Assembly lines were used to produce tanks, airplanes, bombers, and jeeps. Metals were recycled for the production of parts for these instruments of war. And women worked in factories and scrapyards to supplement the labor force demands. Despite this topic, or the occurrences thereof, being relatively recent in history, there was very little in the way of primary resources. However, I was able to find quite a few databases and digitalized oral histories and government publications that were instrumental in this research topic. The executive orders of Franklin Delano Roosevelt establishing the Office of Production Management, the Office of Supply Priorities, and the Allocation Board, as well as the War Production Board, and of course his radio address, The Arsenal of Democracy, were relatively easy to find. His radio address is also very well documented in numerous secondary sources, such as A.J. Bamey's The Arsenal of Democracy, FDR, Detroit, and an Epic Quest to Arm in America at War. Now, Truman's executive order, as he came in at the end of the war, his executive order was to establish the Civilian Production Administration, which also published documents related to this topic. Were instrumental in these were all instrumental in helping finding these publications, because as government agencies they would frequently publish their own contracts. Now, one of these contracts was, or not contracts, sorry, one of their publications, such as the U.S. Civilian Production Administration's Industrial Mobilization for War History of the War Production Board, and the War Production Board's publication, the alphabetical list of major war supply contracts, were immeasurably helpful in identifying the major contributors to the war effort and who contributed the most, such as General Motors, Ford Motor Car Company, and Chrysler. Now, General Motors also published annual reports at the time, which are used extensively to identify specific numerical data streams, such as the rate of employment, how many plants were used to produce certain products, such as tanks or airplanes. There is a great deal of war posters. General Motors produced one that was entitled, "For God's Sake, Send Planes." These war posters were used to increase productivity. They inspired a measure of patriotism and basically said that if you donated, you were helping the war effort. You were helping our boys come home. Now, as such, this goes towards the principle of research methodology. All of this was conducted online, with the exception of these few books like the A.J. Bamey's Arsenal of Democracy, and online libraries in repositories. Joe's store and Artist store were very helpful, as was the Library of Congress online. All of my research amounts to the fact that the American auto industry was, as Thomas Morgan writes in his article, the main reason the Allied powers were able to overthrow those of the Axis powers. We produced more airplanes, more bombers than ever before. These bombers were the ones that, such as the B-24 Liberator, that dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, after which the Japanese surrendered. Without those bombers, they may not have surrendered, and we may not have won the war. The amount of money spent by the auto industries and by the government in support of these industries was in the billions. And it did not go to waste.